All right. So we've already talked a little bit about what the difference is between productive and destructive conflict. So one of the things that I want to just cover with you real quick is the difference between hard skills and soft skills. So hard skills are things like preparing a tax return, a real estate transaction, data collection, right? These are things that we do that we're taught a process or a system on how to do it. The soft skill part of it is how we behave, what we think, right? And how those thoughts lead to outcomes and things like that. So everything we're going to talk about in what we're going to do today, it's more along these soft skills. And so we're going to focus primarily on things like self-awareness, behavior styles. We're going to get into conflict management, obviously, and some problem solving. And so one of the interesting things that we get to do as we work with people, so a lot of times, and I'm sure you've seen this as you've hired people and brought them on, it's not usually the technical part of it that is hard for people to understand and execute. It's how they're doing it, what they're thinking, their whatever mental block or mindset belief that they have that leads to the outcome that you ultimately get from them. So we're going to focus in on that. So conflict, right? It's kind of like, it's not a bad word. It's just what we do with it. And so we're going to talk about things like, if we do not have conflict, what do we have? We have something that's called group think. And group think is like consensus thinking. And so what we don't want is everybody just agreeing with each other for the sake of agreeing. We want to make sure that there's diversity and that people aren't afraid to bring up things. I know for me, one of the things I struggle with is when there is a lot of conflict in the room or somebody just continues to argue and argue and argue. It's not that I agree with them. It's just that it wipes me out and I'm like, I'm done. I'm going to go take a breather and I'm going to collect my thoughts, and I'm either going to choose to argue with you a little bit more, or I'm just going to move on and maybe sweep it under the rug. And those are some of the behaviors I know about myself. So when I start to pick up that rug and sweep it underneath, I know I need to put it back down and go back and try again, right? And not just let go of the disagreement. So that's just me, but we're going to talk through some of that stuff. All right. So here's a poll. You can open up your chat. Well, you know what? We don't even really need the chat, but you can use it. Use the chat. What percentage of employees say that resolving conflicts in a timely manner is crucial to their job satisfaction? 92%. Yeah, 92% of employees say that resolving conflicts in a timely manner is crucial to their job satisfaction. And what's interesting about that is it's everybody knows, right? If something is getting swept under the rug, it's not like people don't know that that's happening. And so what happens, especially for people that we employ, if they have perceived something and had the courage to speak up and say something about it, and we don't act on it or acknowledge it and then try to work through that with them, then what happens? We run into a situation where we are losing trust, right? They are lacking in trust to us. Okay, so let's talk about this encounter here, right? So I have my encounter, whether it's letting somebody go or poor performance or whatever it is, or somebody that just doesn't want to have lunch with me. We then run into two ways that we can handle it typically. So if we want to move toward the green, our green is our productive conflict, we move into different types of listening. And so you'll get a copy of this recording. And if you go back and listen to last month, it's all about the different types of listening. And so the two best ways to listen is either active listening or empathetic listening. So if you think about empathetic listening, this is the listening that is kind of at the top of the chart. This is I cry, you cry, right? I feel what you feel. I'm completely engaged and submerged in this and understanding why you're responding the way that you are. Active listening is when I'm asking questions like, tell me more. I think I heard you say this. Am I correct? Is it, what I'm gauging the whole time how listening to you is being heard, and I'm showing you that I value your time, right? And there's this interaction that's happening. So the best thing you could do is try to couple these things together, because in a workplace, the I cry, you cry kind of thing works. Yeah, it works when we're bereavement, right? Someone loses a family member, or dog passes and we're just feeling for them and we're with them in the moment. That's great. If they're crying about the fact that they're not performing well and they're dragging you into a place that's unhealthy and you need to be in a place of authority, this is not an I cry, you cry situation. So you got to be careful not to know when the emotion is appropriate to be going there a little bit deeper and exposing yourself, and know when it's maybe a little less appropriate. But you want to couple these together. Listening to respond happens quite often, where people are saying, I'm listening to you, but I'm not really, because I'm just trying to think of the next thing I want to say while you're talking. And if you're ever in that state where you're thinking about how you want to respond, you want to kind of check yourself a little bit, because now you're already heading toward potential conflict because you're not actually listening to them. So the next phase, right? We either have a respectful exchange, or we start to feel either we're being criticized, or that maybe the tone of voice starts to shift and things like that. Okay. So then we have an openness or willingness to share, versus this, we're either threatening or feel threatened. And so the one thing I want you to know as we're going through this is you got to pay attention to your emotions in order to enter into a space of conflict well. And so if your emotions are taking over, you either need to press pause and then get yourself in a better place, or, try to, what is causing me to feel threatened right now, right? Then we move into effective questioning, and sometimes we move into silence. Okay. So if you tend to just get silent, you got to just watch yourself. I'm watching the smiles. We have some silence on the call, right? Then we move into things like verbal hostility. So I might be silent long enough to then snap at you because now I'm mad. Or we could be on the positive side of things, considering what challenges. This is a challenge. I'm going to challenge it back. Now we're having a healthy exchange. And that leads us to things like innovation, which are great. Or we could be completely destructive, where things are just absolutely violent. And I can tell you from a violent standpoint, I'm not proud of it, but I was so frustrated one time talking with somebody else that I was working with, and I felt very violated because of the tone of their voice. I'm getting screamed at. And because I'm not a screamer, I'm more of a discusser. I took my fist and I pounded on the table to the point it hurt. Like, it didn't hurt in the moment, but I realized afterward that I definitely hit the table pretty hard. But I didn't know how to get it to stop. So because I was silent for so long and I felt attacked and I felt threatened, I slammed the table because it was the only thing I knew how to do to get it to stop. But what was actually happening is I was moving into this physical violence place that I really had no intention on getting there. But all these other things that were happening were leading me to a place to act out. Okay. Not okay. Not okay at all. Where if we had just kind of taken a break from one another, we could have been more in the innovation space, which when things were healthy, we were certainly innovating all the time. Okay. So any questions, any thoughts, any things that have come up in your life that you want to talk about? No, Becca says moving on.
All this conversation just makes me think of all of the people in my life who handled conflicts well, and then those who did not, and seeing how far it got down on the spectrum. And so it's making me smile thinking about some things that were done well, and then other things that it's like, oh yeah, that happened. Oh yeah, that happened, so
Yeah.
thanks for the trip down memory lane.
Yeah. It's good stuff. Anyone else?
I would just ask, like, say you get too far down the red road here, would you say that taking a break is probably the best way to handle it rather than, okay, I'm gonna start trying to be more this green person in the middle of the red road?
Mhm. Yeah, so I want you to think about it. It's kind of like this continuum, okay? And
Right.
so it starts out very much that pause is the place to go.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's like level 1 is the pause. I'm not going to be productive during this conversation. It's not ever going to sound this articulate, by the way, right? So I'm not expecting you to say it this way, like, hey, I can't talk right now because this isn't going anywhere. I do want to talk about it. It's important. I see it's important to you. It's important to me. So you want to validate, but you need to press pause because otherwise nothing, like if you want something out of me and you want a response out of me, then I need to walk away for a minute. I need to better understand where you're coming from, and then I can re-engage. Okay, so that's level 1. Level 2 will be that you start to learn how to easily recognize what is going on in your brain that causes you to feel threatened. Now, I'm not talking about a real threat where like somebody comes and starts to, hold a gun to your head, right? Those are real threats. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about in relationships with people that you're with on a regular basis. You respect them, they respect you. In those situations, you have to figure out those things that kind of trigger a thought or trigger an emotion. It's likely tied to something in a childhood or a past experience that you're tying that to this, and it doesn't belong there. And so that's where like we grow in this like emotional intelligence. So level 2 is you start thinking about this light green area, right? This active listening. How can I take a breath, calm myself down, and start asking you good questions just so I can better understand where you're coming from? Because right now I'm feeling like I'm being criticized, and I know that's not your intention. So let me ask you some questions. So you want to start moving down that road of green, but it's not usually like a, well, Leah, why aren't you considering the challenges and challenging back? Right? Like we're not saying that because that takes time to get there. And honestly, like I've been learning about behavior for like a lot of years, right? Like almost 2 decades. And I still think my husband's criticizing me when he's really just trying to help me. So I'm not saying you don't perfect it. You just try to learn yourself enough to get to the root cause of why you feel the way you feel. Because if you can understand what you're believing, you're going to understand your behavior. Go ahead, Patty.
Yeah, just a yes and on that. It really becomes it's it's a personal journey to get yourself to the green as always, and the acronym I always use, and I use it with my husband, is are we hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? We should not be having this conversation because you lose your emotional intelligence when you're at halt. Hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, and so it's, I'm around my husband, so we're not ever really lonely, but it's like hat, we're hat, we shouldn't do this right now, let's back away. And so that's really helped, but it is a very personal journey to get from red to green, but you can lose yourself when you are in those instances, so having that intelligence to be like, where am I? Okay, I'm not those. I am sound of mind. Let's continue. Is good to always consider.
Do you have a probing question or something that you could say, similar to like what Patty's saying? I can recognize when that stuff's happening. And so I'm like, we need to take a breather and come back to this conversation. My husband's approach is definitely more of like, no, let's settle it now, which isn't going to end constructively. And we know that from past experience. So anything I can probe in that setting or ask to try and help with the pause.
Yeah. So what I would say, and it's worked for us and it's still working for us, is you kind of set ground rules when things are good. right? So when you're having a good day or you're out, you know, walking the baby or whatever you're doing, right? Whatever it is that you're doing that's fun and you're in a good place, what you want to do is say, you know, sometimes when we have these interactions, we've talked about this before, I'm doing this, you're doing that, and we both have the best intentions, but this is what I need. And I want you to know that it is so important to me to resolve it as quickly as possible. So what can we do? Just ask, what would be something I could say or do in that circumstance that could give me the space to just breathe for a minute and give you the reassurance that we're going to solve it. Because it's a man woman a lot of times thing, just because, you know, we've kind of all said we've got relationships that we're in, right? And so we want to be as respectful to their needs as we are to our own needs. And so it's just a fine balance. So I would say decide what that is between the two of you, because the first few times you use it, whatever that is that you choose to do, there's going to be conflict anyway, because he's still going to want to resolve it. You're still going to want a minute to think about it, right? We all process differently. Sometimes we need to think it through. Sometimes we need to talk it through. And because he's a talker and you're a thinker, right? We just have an imbalance there a little bit. So I would say decide together. So the probing question is asking the question, what do you think we could do when you guys are in a really good, healthy place?
Love that.
And I'll even add to that really quick too, is like, I know for me, like I've also had to recognize like my body, like if I'm starting to like feel agitated or frustrated or whatever it is that's not healthy, I've really had to start paying attention to my body. So it's like, because I know that my emotions, a lot of times I'll feel it before I think it. And so then when I feel it, I'm like, okay, I know it's going to make it to the brain soon. And then I'm probably going to have a reaction instead of a response. So if I can like feel myself getting frustrated or like hot or like whatever, then that's when I'm like, ooh, I need to take a deep breath or I need to do a pause. So, and everybody's bodies, you know, react a little differently. Sometimes if some people are frustrated, you might start flailing your arms or you might like whatever. I don't know. It's also good to pay attention to your body as well.
That's such a good point. I always, one time with my therapist, I was talking to her and she would always say, notice that, right? In the most gentle way. And I was like, well, how am I going to know? Like, how's my body? So we went through a whole exercise and like I got to a state of stress where I was able to know exactly what parts, like if my hand is over my chest, now I know that if I put a lot of pressure on my heart, because that's where it hurts me. You know what I mean? So it's like I notice now if I'm putting my hand on my chest, I've got to kind of call the moment on a pause. So it might be a headache for you. It might be that you're tapping your leg really fast and you may be running for the bathroom, right? You don't know what it is. That's gonna, right? It's extreme, but we've all been there. So you got to just recognize what's going on. We cover all areas of health. Anyway, all right. Moving on real quick. I'm just going to touch on DISC. I know Jess is very familiar with DISC. Patty, Leah, familiar with DISC? Okay.
Yes.
I'm not going to go deep into it, but I want to just focus on DISC in conflict and what tends to happen. So you can identify it if you understand at least enough about kind of where somebody is on the DISC, where they're at. So our eagles, right, they tend to fight, right? They don't take it personally and they get over it quick. Meaning if I'm in conflict with somebody who's an eagle, they are having the conflict and then they're good. Everything's been resolved. I've moved on. And then if you're not a D, you've not moved on. And depending on which style, right? If you're horizontally across, if you're a dove, you've now carried that for a month, right? And so you've got to watch that kind of thing. So you have to understand.
I love the birds. I just love the birds. That tickled me. I've never seen that before. So you said we can interrupt. I'm just interjecting. I love the birds.
No, I love it.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Birds are great. I
we've got
especially
our
love the parrot. Cool.
identify with the parrot, Patty. Are you a parrot?
I'm an ID, yeah. I used to be
Okay.
a DI and then I flipped when I started my own business. So pretty cool.
Yeah, interesting how that happens, right? So parrots, they fight for people or themselves, right? So they'll fight. It's just got to be somewhat emotionally related to humans. They don't typically fight over tasks, and they don't love injustice, right? So if there's any injustice happening, they're gonna game on, because they're gonna make sure that they're out there rallying the troops and getting everybody to a healthier place. We have our doves. Okay, they tend to have a flight tendency, and so they may completely avoid conflict altogether, and so they'll fight or flight if it negatively impacts a team, meaning they will first fight and speak up. They may only speak up to one person, but they're going to speak up inside of a workplace. And so if nothing's done about it, they will likely leave the workplace. Okay. And then we have our owls. They'll fight only with facts. So they do tend to have a flight tendency depending on what it is, right? If it's not correct and they've addressed the fact that it's not correct and nobody's done anything about it or listened to them, they may fly away. But they will fight facts. So if you are arguing with an owl and they just keep fighting back, they might be right, because they don't usually speak up unless they're right. So you just want to kind of pay attention. They do withdraw if it escalates. So if it gets too loud, too violent, too argumentative, too much of a debate, and they know they're correct and the other person isn't acknowledging anything that they're saying, which, not to say owls acknowledge what other people are saying either, right? You get two owls in this situation, you got a problem. But they will withdraw. And it doesn't mean that they agree with you. It just means they're done fighting with you. And so just always pay attention horizontally. Owls and parrots are going to have a hard time if they're in conflict, and doves and eagles are. And so if you're in that type, if you're in that type of relationship, just pay close attention, because if you can both understand that this is what's happening, then you can do something about it. But if you ignore that, this is how I handle conflict, right? So if I'm a dove and I'm arguing with an eagle, I have to try really hard to not take that conflict into tomorrow. Okay. And that is very difficult. Meanwhile, the eagle has to understand that they likely will take it into tomorrow. So they got to be careful about how that fighting is taking place. It's all a balance, right? Like, one person can't be the only one. There's got to be two people in every relationship, whether it's at home or at work. Any questions on that? This is more just for you to observe, to know how they handle conflict. So we're not taking it personally. Okay. All right, this is our last poll. Which generation rate the importance of conflict resolution skills higher than any other generation? Yeah, you know what's interesting is it's actually Gen Y. It's the millennials.
We're the ones that rated as highly important. Okay.
Yeah, it's wild how it works, right? And I think the thing is they just have this emphasis on this conflict resolution skills, but recognizing like the perception of workplace conflict and how it's evolving this is all this multi-generational workforce that's doing it, right? The difference with millennials is they have watched Gen X and baby boomers and what happens when conflict's not addressed. And so I'm going to tell you a super fast story, is that my dad actually died at 48. And part of the issue was he was so afraid, which we didn't find all this out till after he died, but he was afraid to have a surgery that he needed to have. He needed bypass surgery. And he was afraid that he was going to get fired from his job. He never talked to anybody at his job, because you just didn't talk about personal stuff. You didn't, there was like, conflict wasn't a thing, right? So if I have a conflict in my personal life, I didn't bring it to my boss. I just dealt with it. So because he was afraid of that conflict and afraid that he'd lose his job because he needed an extended period of time off, he chose not to have it and died. And so because I've seen that, I'm not a millennial, I'm Gen X, right? But because I saw it, I have a better understanding of why that's important. I'm 1977 is the year I was born, so I'm kind of on the end of Gen X, but millennials, my kids have heard every story, right? My kids are Gen Z, but I can tell you that my kids, people that have worked for me, I have told my parents' story a million times. I do what I do today because of both of my parents, right? My mom had a stroke, 45 years old, workplace stress, right? It's all that kind of stuff that we want to avoid for other people. And so I just thought this fun fact, after conflict resolution training, 59% of employees experience a decrease in workplace stress, right? When we call it out, this is why this soft skill stuff is so important. People, you know, it's hardly soft by any means. These skills, they are the hardest skills to develop. But if we just talk about it and address it and hit it head on, hey, spouse, when we have conflict, you're doing this and I'm doing this. What's something we can do to make it better next time we have a conflict like that? When we call this stuff out and just talk about it, we're automatically going to have a decrease in the stress that we have. Okay. So these are just some quick highlights. Work on building a culture of strong relationships and trust in your workplace. Develop a system for problem or conflict resolution, right? It's what we were just talking about. Build into your meeting structure for people or process issues. Understand the person who's experiencing the issue. Help them clearly state the problem. Ask great questions. Help them gain clarity. You want to understand both sides of the issue before you intervene. Stay neutral, right? So this is you coaching people through solving conflict in your workplace. Stay neutral. And then make sure that you can collaboratively look at the issues from all different angles, find a solution, assign next steps, hold people accountable, right? Don't just say we're going to do stuff, do it, and then hold them to it. If it's still unresolved, we want to go to HR for additional support, which might be corrective action plans. And this is just a disclaimer: violence at work or home should not be tolerated, and please contact a superior or law enforcement if need be. Okay. Any questions before we move on? Conflict, comments?